When Alice Templeton was just a girl of 10, she watched her father board a train bound for an uncertain mission overseas. The world was caught up in the final throes of a global war then, and she remembered how every adult's eyes brimmed with the tension of farewells that might be forever. There was no promise of safety, no assurance that those who left would ever walk back through the door. She stood on the platform in her neat little coat, her heart lodged in her throat, wondering how a place as vast and impersonal as a train station could become the site of such personal heartbreak. When her father vanished into a sea of uniforms and steam, she felt something change deep inside. An unspoken vow that if she ever loved, she would love with all her might, refusing to let the fleeting nature of existence hold her back from the beautiful possibility of connection. The train carried her father away that day, and though he would eventually return, frail, haunted by what he had seen, yet alive, Alice learned that wars had a way of swallowing people whole and spitting them back out transformed. She grew up in a Maryland household steeped in quiet resilience, her mother's trembling sighs overshadowed by outward stoicism. The war ended, but the wounds left behind never fully healed. By the time Alice reached her early 20s, she had become a calm, introspective young woman, someone who found solace in the pages of books and the lull of daily rhythms. She pursued teaching, drawn to the promise of shaping young minds in a world that might, she hoped, learn from its blood-stained past. In the summer of 1950, just as the memories of the previous war had begun to recede into history, Alice found herself standing on another train station platform, this time in a simple linen dress. The station was small, a mere outpost on the edge of farmland and quiet neighborhoods, yet the day vibrated with significance. She was not there to say a final goodbye to a father figure. Instead, she was there to kiss her husband, Martin Templeton, farewell. It was his last assignment, or so he had told her, one final diplomatic posting in Germany that would last only a few weeks. He was a military linguist, a man of gentle humor and subtle intellect, fluent in 5 languages. He carried a paperback under his arm wherever he went, explaining with a grin that he never knew when downtime might strike, and he didn't want to waste a moment idle. They embraced on that platform, a gentle breeze ruffling Alice's dark hair. She rested her cheek against Martin's starched uniform, trying to memorize the warmth of his chest and the way he whispered to her, "It's only 3 weeks, love. I'll bring you back something ridiculous from Berlin, maybe a novelty clock or a gaudy souvenir." She laughed quietly at that, simultaneously trusting and yet harboring a faint echo of unease. The train whistled, its mechanical breath swirling around them, and then Martin boarded. His eyes shone with affection and a flicker of something unspoken, perhaps the awareness that the world of post-war Europe was in tumult and nothing was guaranteed. When the train finally pulled away, Alice watched until it vanished around a curve, feeling a pang in her chest she couldn't quite name. She had no way of knowing that this moment, ordinary yet so profound, would be the last time she would see Martin for decades. The official story arrived weeks later, delivered by men in crisp uniforms. Martin's convoy had been attacked while crossing into East Germany. There had been an explosion, no remains recovered. Alice's mind reeled at the idea of losing him so abruptly, at the cruelty of not even having a body to bury. The military told her it was an accident, that the specifics were classified, and she, being young and in shock, didn't push for details. She sat quietly, a teacher with a shattered heart, gazing at the small wooden box they offered with Martin's meager belongings. Inside, she found his glasses, a few battered papers she didn't understand, and his worn copy of Les Miserables with her name, Alice, scribbled inside the front cover. It felt too intimate, too painful, to hold an object so well loved by him. She put the book on her shelf that night and never opened it again. Life as it does pressed on. The house they had hoped to fill with laughter and perhaps children remained silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Alice returned to the school, teaching English literature to bright-eyed adolescents who asked her about Shakespeare and Chaucer, unaware of the heartbreak she tucked behind her gentle smile. Over time, she grew older, her once vivid hair fading and her face adopting the lines of quiet sorrow. She attended the weddings of her neighbors, visited her aging parents, and kept Martin's photograph perched on the windowsill, where the morning light would warm his features as though he were still with her. People spoke in hushed tones of how the poor dear never remarried. But no one truly questioned it after a while. It was simply a fact of Alice's existence. She had loved, lost, and chosen to remain constant to that memory. Yet beneath her stoic exterior, a gnawing doubt lay dormant. The official story of Martin's death did not sit right with her. Too many oddities, too many cryptic remarks from the men in uniform, and a sense she couldn't shake that Martin was not the sort of person to simply vanish without a farewell. The idea that he had been spirited away by some darker force flickered in her mind now and then. The Cold War was blossoming, tensions simmered across continents, and the world of espionage and secret dealings seemed all too plausible. But what could she do? She was just a teacher, so she kept her doubts private, reasoning that if Martin truly were alive, he would find a way back to her. If he did not, perhaps that meant the unthinkable had truly happened. In either case, she told no one of her suspicions. 70 years passed, slow and relentless. The calendar changed its digits from the 1950s to the modern age, and the quiet suburbs of Maryland transformed with roads and new subdivisions. Alice, well into her 90s, stayed put, refusing to leave the home she and Martin had shared. She did not fear solitude. Perhaps the house itself felt like a living memory, full of echoes of what had once been. When her health began to fail, it was her great-niece, Julia, who arranged for her to move into a small assisted care facility. It was a reasonable choice. The house had grown too large, the steps too steep, and her body too fragile. Julia was a warm-hearted young woman with a penchant for detective novels and an inquisitive streak that often led her to rummage through old family records, diaries, and photographs, curious about the genealogical tapestry from which she'd emerged. She treated Alice with gentle respect, sensing that behind her aunt's quiet eyes lay an ocean of untold stories. When it came time to sort through the old brick house's belongings, Julia approached the task methodically, labeling boxes of books, kitchenware, and personal effects for donation. Then, in the study, a room that had once been Martin's domain, she stumbled upon a battered copy of Les Miserables, sitting precisely where Alice had placed it 70 years prior. Holding the old book, Julia felt an inexplicable pull. She knew the story of Martin, that he had died in an accident overseas, or so the official record went. But for reasons she couldn't articulate, her hands trembled slightly as she flipped open the cover. The spine, delicate with age, creaked in protest. She saw the inscription, "Property of Martin Templeton. For my dearest Alice," accompanied by her aunt's name scribbled in Martin's neat handwriting. The pages, yellowed and fragile, exuded a faint scent of dust and old paper. As she fanned through the text, the book fell open to a section near the middle, revealing something entirely unexpected. In the hollowed interior, cleverly carved so that only someone specifically looking would notice, Julia discovered a small, folded piece of paper and an old ID card. She lifted the ID card first, squinting in disbelief. The photograph was undeniably Martin's. The same gentle eyes, the same subtle tilt of the head. But the name was not Martin Templeton. Instead, it read Eric Dalton, accompanied by official stamps and a notation she could not decipher. Confusion rippled through her. Then, carefully, she opened the folded paper. Its text was brief, typed in an official-looking manner. If found, contact C. Strathmore MI6. Do not involve U.S. intelligence. Immediate risk to asset remains. The wording was cryptic, reminiscent of spy novels and clandestine instructions from a world of secrets. Julia could hardly process what she was seeing. She wasted no time searching for answers. The idea that Martin might have been tied to some intelligence operation was mind-boggling, especially after decades of believing he died in a war-torn stretch of Europe. Searching for C. Strathmore, she discovered a mention of a Clive Strathmore, a retired MI6 codebreaker rumored to live in rural Oxfordshire, England. He was 91, living a quiet life off the grid, but occasionally reached by historians and archivists seeking to clarify bits of obscure Cold War history. Summoning both courage and curiosity, Julia wrote him a letter explaining her find, sending photos of the ID card and the note. To her surprise, he replied promptly, inviting her to bring the materials to him personally if she truly wished to unravel the secrets behind them. It was a leap, but her gut insisted that the discovery was too significant to dismiss. Julia took a flight to London, then a train to the countryside, eventually knocking on the door of a quaint cottage. Clive Strathmore, nearly blind, greeted her with a warmth that belied his storied past. In the cozy interior of his home, where old maps and shelves of thick tomes lined the walls, she produced the folded paper and the ID card. He handled them with care, running his fingertips over the texture of the note, a relic from a bygone era. As soon as he read the typed instructions referencing MI6, his expression turned grave. This was part of a courier cipher from the early Cold War, he explained. We used thin, specialized paper, the edges shaved so they could be hidden in book spines or behind photographs. The note references a need to conceal an asset from U.S. intelligence, suggesting a rift in collaborative espionage between Allied forces. It also implies the asset's identity was compromised. He paused, tapping a finger on the name Eric Dalton. If Martin Templeton was rebranded under that name, it meant someone with significant authority pulled those strings. He effectively vanished from the record, living a new life with a new name. Then he examined the ID card, noticing the official stamps and insignia. This is genuine, he muttered. Issued by a covert branch. The year is smudged, but you can see it lines up with the early 1950s. We had some joint ops with American intelligence back then. Some smooth, others riddled with friction. He read the typed words on the slip of paper, frowning in concentration. Transfer route terminated. Asset separated. ID assumed. Package intact. Emergency relocation approved. Each phrase is loaded with meaning. It suggests a mission that collapsed, leading to a drastic step of giving this man a new identity to keep him safe. Or perhaps to keep others safe from him. Hard to say which. For Julia, it was as though the ground beneath her had shifted. All her life, she had believed that her aunt's husband died a tragic death in Germany. Now she discovered that he might have been part of a covert operation, forced or persuaded to vanish, never to see Alice again. The question that pounded in her mind was the same one her aunt must have wrestled with for decades. Why didn't he come home once it was safe? Clive sighed, removing his reading glasses. For many of these so-called burned assets, returning was not an option. If they tried, it might expose them or worse, endanger their loved ones. The Cold War was vicious. People were disappeared not just by enemies, but sometimes by their own side if it served the bigger picture. Armed with new knowledge, Julia traveled next to Geneva, using a contact Clive had given her, a discreet archivist who maintained old intelligence banking records. Within a week, a response arrived confirming an active account under the name Eric Dalton, opened in 1953 and untouched since 1965. The last known mailing address was in Zurich. More puzzle pieces slid into place. Why open an account in 1953 unless you were establishing a new life, cut off from everything you once knew? Julia's next step was to hire a local investigator in Zurich, a diligent woman named Bettina who specialized in genealogical and archival research. Bettina unearthed records of a small P.O. box under Dalton's name, connected to an address near Lake Zurich, a modest retirement flat. Yet the city's vital records also turned up a death certificate dated 1978. Eric Dalton, cause of heart failure, no next of kin, quietly laid to rest with minimal ceremony. Another dead end, or so it seemed. But Bettina refused to give up. She spoke to the landlord's widow, an elderly lady who recalled a foreign tenant named Dalton who spoke multiple languages and lived reclusively. When he died, the authorities removed the body, but left behind a small box of personal belongings in storage. The landlord's widow produced that box, dusty with decades of neglect. Inside it lay a trove of items that made Julia's heart pound. A battered typewriter, several notebooks with cryptic entries and coded phrases referencing asset movement and linguistic extraction, and a stack of photographs. Many depicted bleak or nondescript cityscapes, harbor docks at dusk, and roads in unnamed towns. But then, at the bottom of the box, separated by a thin sheet of yellowed tissue paper, was a set of images that stunned Julia. They were all of Alice, taken at various times and places she recognized. There was Alice walking into her school, wearing a neat skirt and carrying papers. Alice on a bus, gazing out the window, evidently unaware she was being photographed. Alice sitting on a park bench, reading a book. Some images spanned years, the subtle changes in her attire and hair marking the passage of time. The final photo in the pile, dated in the corner to 1975, showed her older, grayer, but still poised, stepping out of a small shop. The angle suggested it was taken from across the street, secretly. In each shot, the vantage point was distant enough to hide the photographer's presence, yet intimate enough to capture the gentle lines of Alice's face. On the last page of a notebook found in the box was a note written in Martin's unmistakable hand, though time and secrecy had worn away some of its clarity. She was the only piece I ever knew, couldn't come back, but I never left. Reading that sentence, Julia felt tears threaten. All these years, Alice had believed Martin gone forever, dead in a foreign land. Yet here was proof that not only did he survive, but he watched her from the shadows, forced to remain invisible. The heartbreak in those words was palpable. A man exiled from his own life, clinging to glimpses of the love that once anchored him. Armed with this undeniable truth, Julia returned to Maryland, her heart torn between the tragedy of it all and the strange relief that Martin had never truly abandoned Alice in spirit. She visited her aunt in the care home, carefully explaining the story piece by piece, uncertain how a 100-year-old woman might react to such a revelation. Alice, frail yet sharp in mind, listened with eyes brimming with years of sorrow. At times her breath caught in her throat, as though she were reliving the day of that final goodbye on the train platform. Julia showed her the notebooks, the coded phrases, and finally the photographs. Dozens of them, capturing her every move in black and white secrecy. The last item she laid out was a single photograph of Martin himself, older and bearded, standing by a bench with a copy of Les Miserables visible at his side. The shock on Alice's face was immeasurable. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply tracing a trembling finger over Martin's features. Then she looked up at Julia, tears rolling down her cheeks, and asked softly, "He was alive all that time? Watching me?" Julia nodded, voice hitching as she told her aunt the final piece. The note. She read it aloud, voice thick with emotion. "She was the only piece I ever knew. Couldn't come back. But I never left." At that, Alice closed her eyes, her breath unsteady. When she opened them again, the heartbreak and longing that had haunted her for decades seemed to give way to a bittersweet acceptance. "He saved his life by giving it away," she whispered. "He saved me, too, I suppose, by never drawing me into that darkness." Days later, as Julia helped her aunt organize the remnants of her personal archives, Alice pulled the battered copy of Les Miserables from a box, the same book she had never opened since the day she set it on the shelf. She held it in her hands, turning it over gingerly, then hesitated. For decades, it had symbolized her old life, her lost love. Now it felt like a portal to the truth. With shaking fingers, she opened it to the pages where Martin had once inscribed her name. No longer was she met with unyielding sorrow. Instead, she felt the faint stirring of closure. She read a few passages, running her fingers over the underlined sentences he had once cherished. The phone in the background rang occasionally with calls from well-wishers, but in that moment, the entire world narrowed down to Alice, the book, and the memory of the man who had died 100 times in her mind, yet lived on behind the scenes until the day a final heart attack claimed him in anonymity. She passed away quietly a few months later, drifting off in her sleep with the Les Miserables pressed gently to her chest. The staff at the care home said she had been unusually peaceful that last week, gazing at old photographs with a soft, almost wistful smile. Julia, in a quiet ceremony, made sure the battered novel was placed in Alice's casket as she had requested, along with the note Martin had left for her. If there was any justice in the afterlife, Julia believed, perhaps Martin and Alice would find each other in a realm free from the constraints of espionage, secrets, and war. She hoped that, somewhere beyond mortal comprehension, They could share the journeys that had been taken from them so many decades before. In the aftermath, Julia gathered Martin's journals, the cipher message, and the ID card bearing the name Eric Dalton, donating them to a Cold War museum in London. She worked with the curator to create a small exhibit that told the story of how one man had sacrificed his identity to save a Soviet linguist and how, in doing so, he lost the life he had shared with his beloved wife. The exhibit was titled The Message in the Book, How One Man Gave Up His Name to Save Another's Voice. Beside the artifacts, a quote from Victor Hugo was displayed, "Even the darkest night will end, and the sun will rise." And just underneath that, a photograph of Martin and Alice taken at the train station in Maryland before his final mission. Both of them smiling, hopeful, unaware of the path fate would steer them down. Visitors who passed through that exhibit often left with tears or murmured words of astonishment. Many found themselves lingering in front of the battered copy of Les Miserables, reading about how it hid the secret that could have rewritten an entire life story. Some recognized the heartbreak of war, of forced separations, of intelligence agencies that demanded silence at all costs. Others simply stood in awe of a love that refused to end, even when forced into the shadows. The museum staff noted how many wrote in the guest book, expressing their sorrow for Alice and Martin, but also their admiration for the quiet strength both had shown in the face of unimaginable challenges. As the days turned into months, Julia reflected on all she had learned. She thought about how Alice had carried on, year after year, always suspecting that something was amiss in the official story of Martin's demise. Her aunt had once confided, in the earliest days of her widowhood, that she would have traded anything for just a single letter from him, some sign he was alive. It pained Julia to know that Martin had tried to send messages many times, but was thwarted by the nature of his covert assignment. The risk was too great, the cost of exposure too high. Instead, he had become a ghost, channeling his longing into clandestine photographs of the life he left behind. Ultimately, he had taken those images with him to the grave, believing it was the only way to keep them both safe. Yet, for all its tragedy, the story had a form of resolution. It took 70 years, but the truth emerged, bringing with it a measure of solace for Alice in her final days. Martin had never stopped loving her, never truly abandoned her. In giving up his name, he had not given up his heart. The old codebreaker in Oxfordshire, Clive Strathmore, summarized it best when he told Julia, "Sometimes in war, and the Cold War was a war in its own insidious way, the fight doesn't end when the bombs stop. It ends when we stop forcing good people to vanish for reasons they can't even question." And so, the final note in the museum read, "He never stopped loving her. He just watched from behind the glass." People who stood before that line would go quiet, letting the weight of it settle. In the hush of comprehension, they recognized how, even in an age defined by fear and suspicion, love could endure, however tragically constrained. In the shards of code and the hollowed-out pages of a novel, one found a testament to the silent watchers, the ones who sacrificed a normal life so that others might never know the full measure of danger lurking in the corners of politics and war. The curator, touched by the entire tale, worked with Julia on a small, optional interactive component of the exhibit. Visitors could read select passages from Martin's coded notebooks, carefully redacted to hide any remaining sensitive data. Some wrote letters on the spot to an unknown soldier, addressing them to whoever had to vanish to protect the rest of us. The museum staff would pin them on a board next to the display, a quiet collection of gratitude and heartbreak. Over time, a mini shrine formed, flowers, postcards, even photos of other families split by war, all placed in a respectful hush of empathy. Julia found herself visiting the exhibit from time to time. She would stand in front of the final image, Martin, older and solemn, perched on a bench with Les Miserables at his side. She imagined him on the day the photograph was taken, perhaps longing for the simpler days with Alice, regretting the path he was forced down. In her mind, she would silently speak to him, telling him that Alice had never stopped loving him, that she wore black not out of blind grief but out of a profound sense that her love, once kindled, could not be replaced. And she would recall how, even in the last stretch of her life, Alice had found comfort in the knowledge that his devotion endured behind 1,000 illusions. Some evenings, alone in her apartment, Julia would reflect on the complexities that define the best mysteries. She saw how the blueprint of a wartime secret wove through every dimension of the Templeton family's story, turning one woman's heartbreak into a testament to resilience. The lines between hero and victim blurred. Martin, forced to exist as Eric Dalton, became both. She recognized that no single phrase or narrative would ever capture the totality of the sacrifice. The puzzle, though solved on paper, remained emotionally intricate, laced with regrets, unspoken confessions, and a bittersweet love that transcended conventional endings. She also considered the small photograph placed in Alice's casket, the image of a young woman on the verge of life, caught unawares, with Martin's reflection in the background. It was a kind of epilogue in itself, a cosmic cameo, suggesting that, for all the illusions of finality in official statements or funeral rites, some bonds refused to break. The camera lens that once documented war-torn streets, that bore witness to diplomatic convoys crossing lines of danger, had at last captured a quiet love story that spanned decades, overshadowed by secrecy but never truly snuffed out. Thus, the ending, though tinted with sadness, was not hopeless. It carried a gentle warmth, the knowledge that both Alice and Martin found a measure of peace. She, in discovering the truth at last, and he, in continuing to love her from the shadows until the weight of years claimed him. Their story joined countless others lost to the hush of classified archives, a reminder that the pages of war are not only stained with grand battles, but also with the subdued anguish and bravery of individuals whose names rarely make headlines. The Argus camera, with its battered exterior and storied past, remained in the museum's glass case, silent yet eloquent. It was, after all, the object that had sparked the unraveling. If not for that final roll of undeveloped film, if not for the curator's curiosity, perhaps the truth would have stayed buried forever. In that sense, the camera was both an instigator and a witness, bridging the gap between false death and hidden life. In quiet circles, historians occasionally debated the ethics of what had been done to Martin, whether the cost was justified or whether it was a shameful byproduct of political power. But for Julia, the moral ambiguities, while intellectually fascinating, were secondary to the real, tender essence of the story. A man and a woman who wanted only to share a life together, yet were thwarted by forces so much larger than themselves. She took comfort in the fact that, in some intangible way, Martin's ghostly presence had been with Alice all along, following her steps, ensuring she was safe, even if it was from a vantage point she never realized. That knowledge reframed the lonely decades not as barren, but as quietly accompanied. In the months after the exhibit's unveiling, Julia occasionally met others who had visited. Some told her how deeply the story resonated, how it reminded them of an aunt, a grandmother, a lost relative whose wartime experiences had never been fully explained. Some asked her if Martin had truly found happiness in Zurich before he died. She could only answer that happiness might be too strong a word for someone forced to live under an alias, severed from the one he loved. Yet, perhaps he found meaning in his covert tasks, and in those fleeting, stolen glimpses of Alice's life. Others asked if Alice's final days were truly peaceful, having uncovered the truth so late. To this, Julia responded that peace comes in many forms. For Alice, even a belated revelation was better than living under the permanent shadow of what if. Time moved forward. The world, shaped by new conflicts and new alliances, kept spinning. The old brick house in Maryland passed into new ownership. In the care home's memory book, staff wrote that Alice Templeton had been a quiet but strong spirit who always looked out the window as though expecting someone. Perhaps, in her own way, she had indeed been waiting for a figure who remained behind the lens. The War Museum in London continued to display the Templeton/Dalton materials, their story overshadowed by grander accounts of battles, perhaps, but never overshadowed in emotional intensity for those who paused to read. Eventually, the museum curated a rotating exhibit featuring personal stories of espionage. The Templeton story quickly became one of its highlights. Groups of schoolchildren would hush each other as they read about how the man took on a false name, never returned to his wife, yet documented her life from afar. Teachers found in it a poignant example of how the Cold War was not merely a matter of Berlin walls and nuclear standoffs, but also of individuals forced into impossible roles. Some children asked if Martin and Alice were ever truly reunited. The teacher would have to respond softly, not in the way they hoped, but they never stopped loving each other. Those who found the exhibit and recognized the heartbreak sometimes wept, leaving behind small tokens, flowers, letters addressed to Alice and Martin. The museum decided to keep a single glass bowl where these tributes could gather. Periodically, staff would collect them, keep a record, and store them away. Over the years, they built a second archive, one of purely human sentiment, containing letters and notes from strangers who saw in the story a reflection of their own lost loves, regrets, or unwavering commitments. For Julia, the entire ordeal was transformative. She continued her genealogical pursuits, but with a renewed sense of empathy for the silent corners of family histories. She recognized that not all secrets are nefarious. Sometimes, secrets shield loved ones from truths too dangerous to bear. The lessons learned from the Templeton puzzle shaped how she approached her own relationships, focusing on honesty but also on compassion, mindful that every story has layers hidden beneath its surface. She closed the loop by writing a long letter to Clive Strathmore, thanking him for his guidance. He replied with a short note, "I'm glad we've helped some souls find rest. Remember, dear girl, knowledge can be a weight or a gift, depending on how we carry it." She framed those words and hung them in her study, a quiet reminder that truth, even when found, demands careful handling. Decades from now, some new wave of museum-goers might stumble upon Martin and Alice's story without prior context. They might read the lines about a man who gave up his identity to salvage a covert operation, or about an old camera roll discovered decades too late. Perhaps they will be struck by the resilience of a love that refused to fade, even under the harsh glare of espionage. In that moment, though the participants in the drama have long since left this world, the intangible cord that bound them together across time might resonate anew. And so, in the hush that follows, we find a quiet but unmistakable kind of happy ending. Not the neat Hollywood version of a triumphant return and kisses on a platform. No, it is a subtler happiness, rooted in the knowledge that Martin's final confession reached Alice's ears before she passed, that in her last months she knew he had never stopped caring, and that, for all the heartbreak, the love they shared had been genuine and enduring. Love, in this sense, found a path through shadows and secrets, bridging decades with intangible fidelity. That is how it ends for them. She, laid to rest with Martin's note by her side. He, memorialized in a museum exhibit that underscores both tragedy and devotion. Their story, once hidden behind war's hush and locked in a battered book, now stands as a testament to the small, luminous truths that can emerge from the darkest corners of history. In that final sense, both parted from the world secure in the knowledge that neither had truly forsaken the other. Yes, a quiet ending, perhaps, but profoundly full of love. And for those who read or hear it, there is an echo of something unbreakable, a flicker of hope that even amid war, secrets, and forced separations, hearts can remain steadfast. For Martin and Alice Templeton, that has to be enough. And maybe, for the rest of us, it is as well. Thanks for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help me out. See you next time.